this this coalition. So the Coalition for PFAS-Free Cooling and Heating. It's a coalition that was created last year, late last year, bringing together a number of European companies working in cooling and heating specifically, and trying to engage with policymakers at the European level on the universal PFAS restriction regulation that's being discussed right now. And will be a key topic for the next couple of years in Europe and beyond. And we wanted to make sure that at least that on the refrigeration side and the heat pump side and the air conditioning side, that there was more engagement on alternatives to HFOs and other blends based on 1234yf, to just reassure policymakers that we can go PFAS free in a variety of applications, because there are many commercially available alternatives today. So that was the of this coalition, and we feel that it is going to play a vital role over the next 2 years to make sure that the debate is balanced in terms of educating and sharing knowledge with policymakers so that they make the right choice. And clearly, we believe that there are alternatives to PFAS refrigerants and specifically TFA. So my name is Mark Shastro, and I'm the CEO of one of the companies, Atmosphere, that's a member of this coalition. And together with my colleague Chinzia, who you might see on the screen. So you can reach out to us if you have specific questions after about the coalition and the role that we play in the policymaking process. So I guess now I can introduce. This is the second webinar that we're hosting since we created the coalition, and really happy to have Hans-Peter Arp join us today. Hans-Peter is originally Canadian, but living in Norway, and has traveled all over the place and studied in many different countries. I think Switzerland, Germany, correct me if I'm wrong, and is currently a professor at the NTNU in Trondheim in Norway. As an environmental scientist, I think chemist be your core focus, and you run a research project funded by the EU called 0PM, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about that. And you've been looking at a variety of different chemicals, and in particular TFA. And I guess that's why we're all here today, is to understand what TFA is, and what a lot of us follow you online and read your research, and when you come out with a statement saying that TFA is a planetary boundary threat, that is a pretty big deal. Okay. So I think that for us is we want to learn more, and we want to kind of see if there are any obvious links with cooling and heating when we're talking about TFA, which is this ultra short chain PFAS. So we will take questions at the end. Hans-Peter has about 40 minutes of slides. They're really valuable. We will share those slides with you after as well. And then we will have 15, 20 minutes for questions at the end. So if you do wish to submit questions, please use the chat. You'll see on the bottom of the window, there's different icons, and one of them should say chat. Feel free to submit those questions, and then I will go through that towards the end of the session, and then ask those questions to Hans-Peter. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear to everyone. And yeah, welcome, Hans-Peter. Really happy to hear about what you found or what you're looking at, and this whole TFA topic. Really kind of, hopefully after this presentation, we'll understand much more what this really means for us, and where we are in terms of research, and where are the gaps still. Okay, so over to you, Hans-Peter. I will mute myself.
Oh, thanks very much, Mark, for that nice introduction. And thank you also for the invitation, and to you all for your attendance today. I will now try to get this screen ready for sharing. It seems to be okay. Great. Um, so just somebody just let me know if you're not seeing my presentation or my slides move.
We're seeing your slides, but we also see on the side each slide. So I don't know if that's done on purpose. If you're not on full screen mode.
Okay, then I'm sharing the wrong screen. Thank you very much
Okay.
for that. And I will share this different screen. Screen two. So now you should see yourselves. And now I'll go over here and sorry. Apologies for the delay.
No worries.
Screen two, sorry. I always double click on Zoom. Okay.
Yep. Now it's working.
Okay, great. Perfect. And so, yes. Okay, so now we can start. Now, before I begin talking about TFA and planetary boundary threats, I want to give a story about a precautionary tale. And that was about one of the founders of the field that I'm in, environmental chemistry, a gentleman by the name of James Lovelock. And what he did was he invented the electron capture detector, which is shown on the screen here. And what this could do was it could, for the first time, measure chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. Before he did that, there was no real way of determining chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. And his reasons were just technical and out of curiosity. He saw the data that chlorofluorocarbons pose no toxicity. They're not dangerous. So he thought that they had no conceivable hazard. This was just research for the sake of research, and he would drive around taking measurements. But then, of course, we found there was a great hazard, a planetary boundary threat level hazard, and that it was destroying the ozone layer. And then so he had to backtrack, saying there was no conceivable hazard to no conceivable toxic hazard. And there's both direct and indirect parallels with the TFA story that I'll be presenting. But I first want to give a shout out and an appreciation to how important the Montreal Protocol is, because it was through the Montreal Protocol that we got rid of the chlorofluorocarbons from refrigerants. And there are projections from NASA that if the Montreal Protocol never happened, by 2050, there would essentially be no ozone left, which would imply that there'd be no photosynthesis left, which would be the end of certainly the terrestrial ecosystems as we know it. So that would be a planetary threat. And it was also quite effective because we see how the Montreal Protocol has led to a decrease in the consumption of ozone depleting substances. So this is a very big success that we can also continue to learn from, especially because the history of Montreal Protocol, successful as it was with the CFCs, is really just a history of burden shifting through what we call drop-in substitution. That's a term used when you just replace a hazardous chemical with a less or similarly hazardous chemical because it involves a less change in your supply chain or technology. So as I'm sure this audience all knows, the second generation of refrigerants was the hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which were less ozone depleting, but they formed greenhouse gases. And the third generation was the saturated hydrofluorocarbons, which were greenhouse gases, and for the first time led to this mild formation of TFA with certain high market production ones. But now we're into the fourth generation refrigerants after the Kincali Amendment, where you have unsaturated hydrofluoroolefins because they have less global warming potential, but they lead to the increased formation of TFA. So the YF refrigerant yields 100% TFA in the atmosphere. It's a one-to-one reaction. And as a result, we can associate this switch to, for instance, YF, but also other refrigerants that form TFA, to its accumulation everywhere, including in remote locations. So This is a well-known study looking at TFA and other short-chain PFAS in the Arctic ice core record. And what you see there is that the TFA concentration shoots up quite a bit on the timeline that's very consistent with the Montreal Protocol. And in a place like the Arctic, the only possible source would be atmospheric, so likely from volatile refrigerants degrading to TFA. But also, we're seeing this accumulate in places many people might not have expected. And this includes in tree leaves. So this is a study from tree leaves in Germany, different species. So this would be needles or also deciduous trees. But they also have an increase inside their leaves. And the reason for that is that TFA is so persistent and mobile, it will go right up the xylem and phlegm of the trees and accumulate in their leaves. And we also see it because of its persistence and mobility accumulating over the years in groundwater. So this is a study from Denmark where they did a survey of all the groundwater wells, most of the groundwater wells in the country. It was well over 200 wells. And they found TFA in most of the samples. And then when they dated that water, that groundwater, based on how old it is, through its isotope ratios, they would find that the more recent the water, the higher the concentration of TFA. So you could even use TFA to age how old the groundwater was. And the only samples that did not have TFA were the very old groundwater samples from before the TFA precursors were introduced in the Montreal Protocol. And since it's increasing in things like leaves, it's going to be increasing in other plant-based fruits and vegetables, such as in wine. So this was a study by a researcher called Mike Mueller, who just sampled different wines, and he would also see this increasing concentration with vintage. And this has been reproduced in a study that came out this week from Pan Europe, where they did a similar type of screening studies of wine from different vintages, and they also see this increase in TFA and wine concentration the more recently it's made. But it's not only water, it's not only wine, it's in everything we drink. So when you look at the concentrations that have been measured in tea or beer or orange juice, they're actually higher than the concentrations that we measure in drinking water. So, and the median concentration of TFA in German drinking water is 1.5 micrograms per liter. In 19 European countries, it's 0.23 micrograms per liter. And I'm going to refer back to these concentrations later in my presentation because they become relevant when we talk about safety thresholds. But what I wanted to show here is that why the TFA is higher in different types of drinks is because you're getting the TFA both from the water and the plants coming together. And this caused us to maybe want to go into this literature data a bit more. We had our own measured data on TFA, but we wanted to understand where TFA has been measured. And we found some data that was done very preliminary in the 90s in relation to the introduction of TFA precursors for the Montreal Protocol. So there was some concentrations measured early on. And so we had these green bars here. This was pre-2010. This kind of coincides with the implementation of the fourth generation of the refrigerants of the Montreal Protocol, which was around 2010. But we had the green bars having smaller concentrations till after 2010, where pretty much the concentration in most media increases. So it's basically ubiquitously increasing in anything and everything that we can measure. And one media I want to talk about in particular is concentrations in blood, because I think it's an important question for everyone to consider what levels of global distribution of TFA in the blood of all humans and all animals that be comfortable with. And to this day, we really only have 2 studies. I'm sure this will increase in future, but there was a study in China that found that 97% of the participants had TFA in their blood with a median level of 8.5 micrograms per liter. And a more recent study in the USA had detections of 74% with the median concentrations of 6 micrograms per liter. And what is important here is if you know about other PFAS and blood, these concentrations of TFA alone is either similar to or greater than the sum of all other PFAS combined. And this is going to increase in future, that we have increasing TFA in our blood. So the decisions we make today will affect the TFA and the blood of the human population now and in the foreseeable future. All that we know for now is that it's going to increase. So my presentation will go through this. That was the introduction of what I want to really present. So this is about the increasing sources of TFA. Then I'll be moving on to their irreversible effects to health and the environment, and also why it is a planetary boundary threat. And then I will go through solutions because I think these are quite urgent to discuss now. So first, to walk through the different sources of TFA. First, there's one thing that I really want to address, because it is said in the documents to the Montreal Protocol, the UNEP scientists have claimed that TFA is of natural origin based on data from the 90s that show that TFA was present in the deep sea. And they said, oh, if TFA was in the deep sea, it must have some kind of deep sea natural source. And this was a hypothesis that was put then, but all the research that we have since that has really debunked that hypothesis. And for instance, if they thought that TFA was coming from a deep sea vent, we would expect to see a TFA gradient as we go deep sea and approach deep sea vents, and we don't see any of those. We also see other mechanisms for which TFA can be in the deep sea, because we can measure other PFAS in the deep sea, we can measure other PCBs in the deep sea, and they can get there through thermohaline oceanic currents. They can go by the sinking of dense water formed off of continental shelves, and they can also be formed from marine snow deposition, which is when organic matter blooms during the spring and then settles as particles, because this algae can also uptake TFA and settle. So there are several more likely hypotheses to account for TFA in the deep sea than a natural formation, which has no mechanistic, no geological explanation. And it's also inconsistent with all the time trends I just showed. So I want this hypothesis to be put to bed and nobody to discuss that, even entertain the possibility that TFA is of natural origin until there's some kind of data that would support that, because right now there is none. But what about the future? So this was a projection from the German Environmental Agency by David Beringer and colleagues about where they would expect TFA to increase from the use of certain refrigerants in relation to the projected market introduction through the Montreal Protocol. And just in the EU alone, they would predict that there would be a large increase by 2050 than compared to 2000. So in 2000, there was about 4,000 this was metric tons, I believe. And then by 2050, it'd be a large increase by over a factor of 10. But if we correlate what this means in terms of the rain concentrations, what we've been observing, so this is the rain concentrations of TFA is likely associated with refrigerants, we would expect that from today's measurement, it would increase by a factor 5 by 2040. And this will accumulate in the water and accumulate in blood. The thing is, once it goes in the atmosphere, these refrigerants, it will convert to TFA and then it'll be in the water, and then it stays in the water. It doesn't revolatilize into air. It goes into the water and it will accumulate in the water, in the groundwater, in the blood, in the plants, and everything that I showed you. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the TFA in the atmosphere is associated from precursor reactions For instance, during this time series in Germany, they get more formation of TFA during the summer months due to more light, leading to photolytic reactions that convert the precursors like YF into TFA. And also the Corey Young and colleagues in Toronto they even have an online TFA measurement device, and they will see always peak concentrations in the daytime associated with sunlight. But this is happening every day. But there are other sources that are important to talk about in addition to refrigerants. One of them is pesticides and herbicides. So there are many chemicals on the market that will have this CF3 group on them, like flufenacet and oxyflorphin in the EU. And in Europe, in America, they use a lot of trifluralin and flumetron. These are generally herbicides to control weed grasses. And they can, based on the use of these precursors, say how much of the TFA is being introduced into various agricultural regions. So this would be a contributing source of TFA into groundwater and local water sources in these regions. Also, several pharmaceuticals have TFA. So these are several high volume production pharmaceuticals for various health reasons, from prostate cancer to AIDS treatment to antidepressants and antidiabetics. They'll also have a CF3 group, which can degrade in the environment to form TFA. And I put the years here, like these were all introduced into the market in the 90s. So kind of coincidentally also around the time that the precursors of TFA were introduced in the Montreal Protocol, but these in general will very rarely enter the atmosphere. Some of them could, but it's mainly degrading in water, and a lot of them will degrade when they're used as sludges or biosolids on farms. So this would also be leading to some of the accumulation of TFA that we see in agricultural regions and groundwater and agricultural regions. And then there's also the release of TFA from PFAS production and products. So there's a lot of TFA emissions, like from the production of these refrigerants. Some of the highest concentrations that you'll ever measure of TFA are around the factories where they make these refrigerants, such as there's this one factory in France which will release from the downstream river. You'll find extremely high concentrations, like 7,500 micrograms per liter, which is much higher, say, than the drinking water concentration of 1.5 micrograms per liter. But also the soil and the air is quite full of TFA. This can come from also other types of factories because they might be producing TFA as an intermediate. For instance, the pharmaceutical companies might be making their TFA locally. So you might get releases from the pharmaceutical factories. But also when we look at fluoropolymers, like fluoropolymer tubing, in the laboratory, we can actually extract TFA from the fluoropolymers and sometimes even from conventional plastics, which also makes analyzing for TFA tricky because you have to account for this background. So there are these sources as well. And what's important to understand in this context is that we can't remove TFA from water unless we put in a lot of energy. It is, as I said, it's extremely persistent and extremely mobile, and that also applies to water treatment systems. So you might have a granulated activated carbon filter in your drinking water plant, or you might have a Brita water filter. TFA will go right through that. It doesn't absorb. There can be ion exchange resins, which are being developed for a lot of PFAS, but they're the least effective for TFA and certainly not commercially effective. You can't degrade TFA with chlorination or ozonation. It's persistent. It's not going to react. It's a stable end product. The only technology that's out there that can really do anything is desalination, like reverse osmosis. In other words, the same technology that you'd use to convert seawater to drinking water. This is the only thing that gets rid of TFA, but it's extremely expensive. It costs a lot of energy, and it ruins the mineral quality of water. Oh, and I also mentioned here that even these oxidation processes, like they can also convert the pharmaceuticals and pesticides into the TFA. So we really only have reverse osmosis, but I want you to remember this would only, if you use that, sorry, this would only take care of the drinking water. You can't use reverse osmosis to wine or juice or anything else. So even if you had reverse osmosis drinking water, I would even question if that's really lowering your exposure to TFA. But just to give you an idea, let's just say we wanted to go down that road and start to remediate TFA and go around all the PFAS polluted areas and start reverse osmosing our water, just so we wouldn't have it. We did a collaboration with the Forever Pollution Project, who are tracking down sources of PFAS throughout Europe, and we calculated, along with my colleague Ali Ling from in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, that the cost would be 100 billion euros per year to clean TFA and its precursors from hotspot water and soil. So this would just make drinking water more expensive to make. I don't know who would pay for it. Obviously, the polluter should pay for it, but try to get that to work logistically. But it's only going to be removing only part of the TFA that we're being exposed to. So showing that we're having this really disturbing increase in exposure and we really can't do anything about it, I'm going to go on to irreversible effects and then planetary boundaries ultimately. So there are varying opinions currently out there on what is a safe level of TFA in drinking water. But I think the study that's getting a lot of momentum now, particularly at the European level with the European Commission, is this approach that they've used in the Netherlands, where they looked at the effect on liver weight versus dose of different PFAS. And they did this to derive so-called relative potency factors. So for instance, PFOA is one of the PFAS on the screen. It's this one, and this is a concentration with which they see an increase in liver weight. And TFA is down here on the bottom of the screen, but they would use this type of a curve to say that TFA is 0.2% as toxic as PFOA, for which there was an existing threshold. And they could use that to derive a safe drinking water concentration of 2.2 micrograms per liter. The problem with that from an exposure point of view is that there are many regions of the Netherlands and Germany and the world where this level is already exceeded in drinking water. And this will be increasing, of course, as there's more exposure to TFA. Another study that has also been getting a lot of attention, and this is being discussed now by ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, was this study on exposing of Han Wistar rabbits to TFA. And they found that the embryos of these rabbits that would have this exposure had multiple folded retina and absent aqueous vitreous humor, which meaning that there was eye deformations in these embryos compared to the historical data, which would give it a classification of a category 1B, presumed human reproductive toxicant, which would have important implications for its safety and management. Moving beyond human health, I'm very interested in what it could be doing to microbial communities. And unfortunately, this has gotten no attention since the 1990s. So I'm trying to encourage all my microbiologist colleagues and biochemistry colleagues to look into that. But what they would find, and this was research that was done in relation with the Montreal Protocol, but not followed up since, was that they would find that if they're exposing TFA to different microbial communities, that the TFA would become part of the biomolecule. So become part of the lipids, it would become part of protein. So you'd have trifluorinated TFA within the proteins themselves and within the lipids themselves. And they could find this by isotopically labeling the TFA and seeing where the isotopic labeling ended up. Acetic acid does the same, which is the non-fluorinated acetic acid, which is otherwise known as vinegar, that also becomes part of biomolecules, but this had a different signature. Now, you might also be thinking, okay, but if it's reacting with proteins and stuff and microbes, is this a way of it coming out of the environment? The answer is no, because microbes are degradable. They degrade all the time. So this would be a temporary storage into the microbes. They would degrade and the TFA would be released and it's just going to be re-entering the environment. They also found the exact similar results with a benthic sediment microbial communities, that they would have an increase in the TFA in the biomolecules compared to the killed controls. What this effects could have on the microbial communities is unknown, and I think this needs more attention. At least some effects could be related to some of the toxicity that they see with microbes such as these algae. So the lowest no observable effect concentration or exposure level for algae communities that causes a problem is 120 micrograms per liter for this species. But because in these ecotoxicity studies, they don't measure every single algae out there, they will derive assessment factors. So they'll assume that it could be more toxic to other microbes. And then different scientists have derived safe levels of 0.2 to 12 micrograms per liter, which gets us into the ambient TFA levels that we're seeing already now. So already now, microbial communities could be impacted. There are higher levels by other agencies such as ECHA, but these also are concentrations that we can see, for instance, near factories. So at least in hotspots. We also have what I think deserves a lot more attention is the indications that it could be having effect on soil and soil health. There has been some studies on this, very few, but they have found no effect on plant growth at 0.83 milligrams per kilogram. So above that, you might get problems with plant growth. And this is a concentration that we can observe sometimes in hotspot areas, but of course, these will increase over time. But there's also at very low concentrations, there was a study that found that at really small concentrations, so even at ambient concentrations now of TFA, you can have effects on soil pH, microbial respiration, bacterial abundance, and litter decomposition, or how quickly the soil, say, converts plant leaves. So these plant leaves here from the trees that fall down, how quickly they will be converted into soil could be affected. So could there be some link between the accumulation of TFA in microbes versus with this effects observed in soil terrestrial health? I don't know, but I think this needs more attention because this could be have wide-reaching consequences. So now I go back to the title of the lecture, which is TFA as a planetary boundary threat. So what do I mean by that? So what a planetary boundary threat is a disturbance to the homeostasis of the Earth. And if you exceed this, then Earth would leave the same Holocene period from which humans evolved. So the chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere destroying the ozone would be changing the Holocene. Climate change can change the Holocene. And so usually what you end up with is that you get this poorly reversible impact, such as from the stratospheric ozone disappearing. And this would even be observed once we get rid of our chlorofluorocarbons. This is still an issue. So the criteria to be a planetary boundary threat is the first condition is that the pollution disrupts a vital Earth system process of which we are ignorant. And this condition has been met because we do know of some impacts, such as effects on liver weight, such as potential effects on soil health, on algal communities. So these are impacts, and we don't even know all the impacts. We have not studied all the ecosystems, all the organisms out there. We just know that it's increasing absolutely everywhere. So it is true that there are some impacts of which we have good indications of and of which we are ignorant. The condition 2 is that the disruptive effect is not discovered until manifested at a global scale. So as an example, if we see that all mammals in the future are starting to get poor eye development, like not just the Wistar rabbits in the test, but humans and every other animal is having problems with their eye development. That would occur at a global scale. It would not just be, it might occur in hotspot regions first, but it could, but these hotspot regions are also global and it would occur globally. And the third condition is that the impacts are poorly reversible because the level of global pollution cannot be readily reduced. And this is true because TFA is already diluted, it's already circulating in our forest ecosystem, so it will persist for some time. So that is why it's a planetary boundary threat. But very briefly, I just want to go through some solutions, and I'll just do this quickly so we can have the time for some questions. One of the important things that we have to do is to call TFA a PFAS. There's a lot of international regulations now about PFAS and PFAS as a class. Some people are specifically trying to exclude that TFA is defined as a PFAS, such as this senator here in America, Tom Carper. But doing so, I guess the motivation in doing so is really just so that the refrigerants or the pesticides that convert TFA do not get the same level of regulatory scrutiny as other PFAS, but it needs this regulatory scrutiny. And this is a reference to a scientific consensus statement of many leading scientists that we should define TFA as a PFAS. It's structurally a PFAS. It is a PFAS. It should be regulated like one. They're also specific to this community, as I'm sure you all know, there are many alternative technologies now to using F gases on the market in all diverse sectors, be it in cars or domestic refrigeration or transportation of refrigeration goods. There's a wide spectrum of technologies that are out there. And of course, these technologies are improving, especially since the late 80s. And of course, as you know, natural refrigerant technology predates the use of the halogenated and fluorinated refrigerants. And so we would want to make this shift with this technology that is available. And I just want to, in that regard, just give a shout out to a professor of my affiliation, NTNU, who I've only found out recently, it was in a different department than I am. But in 1975, the Norwegian professor Gustav Lorentzen, he focused on heating and cooling technology based on halogen-free refrigerants, particularly CO2 refrigerants initially, and that was also motivated by the effects of what halogenated refrigerants can do to the environment. And just to show that transition to this is possible, it's now nearly 100% of the Norwegian supermarkets use CO2 refrigeration systems. So it is possible, and it's also possible in other sectors. I'm sure, as this community knows, that Volkswagen introduced carbon dioxide-based heating pumps in their Volkswagens. Mercedes did for previously, but are not, they will closely monitor the markets for further developments. And companies like Siemens are advocating that it's time to stop using F gases in power grids. There's also a PhD student in our project, 0PM, Romain Figuer. He was looking at alternatives to TFA, F gases used in blowing agents. So they're also used to make foams out of polyurethanes or XPSs. But there's also many material alternatives that do not need blowing agents or alternative blowing agents to stop the use of F gases for this use. For pesticides and pharmaceuticals, lots can be done. A recent example is in Europe, they now stopped renewing the license for flufenacet, one of the major TFA precursors. It's not stated explicitly that TFA production was the reason, but it is becoming more of a consideration for renewing licenses to pesticides if they will form TFA. And also similar things could be done in the pharmaceutical sector by looking for alternative pharmaceuticals or encouraging innovation towards pharmaceuticals that do not degrade to TFA. I'm also the TFA phase out, the PFAS restrictions that are going on around the world are also very relevant because TFA release is associated with PFAS production. So in Europe, we have the PFAS restriction proposal that is ongoing. And there are several bills being discussed, for instance, in the United States that would include ban of F gases. So this is important to develop in the policy level. We also try to make resources within our project to help companies know when they have PFAS in their products. It could be a lot of people don't know, maybe a lot of the markets that you're dealing with don't know about the issue. So we try to make things like the PFAS guide to help people identify if they have PFAS, such as TFA precursors in their project. So this is a website that different companies can look to see if there might be some PFAS in their supply chain. Also related to that is some social media outreach like this rap video that will try to get the message out there to larger audiences. And I encourage you to take a look at this rap video if you haven't already. We also are making a alternative assessment database so that people could find alternative applications to PFAS, such as fluorinated gases, in different sectors. So this is available on this website to help guide, and we hope it'll be like a starting point for companies to help find a way to finding safer alternatives to F gases and PFAS. And also, I think labeling could help. I think people, for instance, when they're buying cars in future or refrigerators, should know if there's a F gas in their product, and this should be labeled more clearly, because I would expect that when this issue is more well known, it could affect market choices, what people would buy, and this would also drive the market. I would predict, if it was labeled properly, towards F gas free products. And there's been a lot of survey that shows that once consumers are informed about PFAS, once they're informed about PFAS, it will affect their purchasing. I can give you references to these studies if you want. And also for the investors out there, there's a lot of to invest in the F-gas free technologies. So there is some initiatives like the ChemSec ChemScore. They give companies a bad grade if they make F gases or other PFAS. But there's also some very high market hedge funds that are exclusively only investing in companies that substitute away from PFAS and F gases. That needs more investment. So just to sum up, we have the tools to transition away from TFA to stabilize exposure. To do that, all you need is love, of course, always, and then to transition to PFAS and TFA-free alternatives. So start with the TFA precursors produced in the greatest volume, and of course, refrigerants, especially the YF refrigerant, is the first thing that should be banned. We should classify and label TFA as a PFAS and integrate it in general PFAS reduction strategies at a national and business level, so that at the policy level, but also company level, and remove TFA from active emission sources, such as industry effluent, ideally versus the polluter pays principle. So all polluters of TFA, I think, should be responsible for their cleanup. With that, I'll just say thank you. And here's a reference to the study where I go over most of this material, and also the website to our project 0PM, where we research TFA and other persistent mobile substances. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Really appreciate you taking the time to present this. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. I see that we have a couple of questions already on the Q&A chat, so feel free to add more. I'll start with Professor Michael Kalfelt, who was actually our first speaker. I referred to Hans-Peter being the second speaker of the series. Professor Kalfelt was the first speaker, so glad to have you back, Michael. And you have a question asking to Hans-Peter, how long will it take until the lower groundwater layers, where some mineral waters come from, will be contaminated with TFA?
Yeah, that is a very good question, but I mean, it is just it all depends on the hydrogeology of the aquifer in question. But I do think it is like an issue that there are fewer groundwater resources that would be TFA free. These are disappearing. And so I would just say the areas that we have like that should be protected, because it is inevitable based on the hydrogeology, but it varies from aquifer to aquifer. Yeah. So
Okay, Michael, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to add it. I see there's also a question from Asa Valley. I hope I pronounced your name
probably
properly from the
OSA.
Swedish EPA. And she has a question referring to one of the earlier slides. Why did TFA disappear in sludge after 2010?
Okay, so that's not that it disappeared. I think that's more that it wasn't measured. So the picture of the data is not really complete, and so we didn't have all the media that was measured before and after. So some of those red and green bars on that slide that I showed TFA in different media are more data rich than others. Sludge is definitely a data poor, so it needs more analysis. And I can say it's quite tricky to measure TFA in sludge, which is and in soil. It's easier to measure from water that you extract from the sludge or water that you extract from the soil than the actual media itself. So it's just a data gap. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Another question from Henning Freitag. What are the costs, efforts of a TFA surface water measurement? And could we imagine a cheap, reliable method in the near future used by the public, farmers, workshops, etc.?
Yeah, well, when I talk to commercial labs that do analysis, they'll always tell you the more demand for an analysis, the cheaper it will get over time. Um, how much does a TFA analysis now set you back? Well, it would usually now probably be also you get a package with TFA and other ultra short chain PFAS. I I want to guess it'll be about um, it'd probably be around between one like maybe 150 to 250 euros, so quite expensive. But probably the price will go down, and certainly for large screening programs that would go down as well as it becomes more routine.
Okay. A question from Dorian Wolf. Are there any ongoing long-term exposure studies of humans and animals to low levels of TFA?
Yeah, not that I know, but I definitely think there should be because this is, I mean, I find this exposure level alarming. And as I always like to point out, that it's intergenerational. What the TFA that we're measuring in the human population's blood now is going to be probably the smallest it will be for the foreseeable future. And so I do think this needs a lot more data and attention. It is hard to get human biomonitoring studies done. Requires a lot of ethics clearance, but I do think it should be prioritized for TFA. So I don't know of any studies, but I would definitely advocate for their necessity.
Okay, well, that's a call out to researchers out there. Another question from Michael Gary, a colleague of ours, who's become a bit of a specialist in writing and reporting on PFAS and TFA. So glad that Michael could join us. Michael is asking, what does the incorporation of TFA in microproteins and lipids suggest about bioaccumulation in humans, given the presence of TFA in human blood serum?
Yeah, well, okay, that is also a very profound question. But obviously, I think like when I think about how TFA is interacting with microbes, including the ones in our gut, it's reaching like every part of our body. Like so, it's in the blood and through the blood. Like just I'll just start there. It's small enough to go through membrane barriers. So there's TFA in our brain. There's TFA in all one of our organs. I don't know if it's interacting with our proteins and lipids the same way it is with microbes. Also something to research. But I mean, definitely, it's also interacting with the microbes in our gut and becoming part of that as well. So I feel like if it's reacting with biological molecules, just like acetic acid would, then I think that is quite profound because this is also about the reservoir of TFA that's out there and circulating within us. So it's not just going through our blood; it's also accumulating, perhaps in us through being present in our lipids. And this would not be tested, right, in a TFA test because it would be already integrated in the molecule. So you'd have to do something like label the TFA with 14 carbon as they do, and then just see if it gets taken up by cells, which is also, I would say, a petition to the biochemical research community to look into that if that is happening or not.
Aye, aye, aye.
It's,
Sorry.
yeah, I just want to say it's amazing what we don't know considering we're exposed to that. And so that's why
Yeah,
I think it's such a concern that we're just putting this chemical out there when we know so little. That's why we have to be precautionary.
it's depressing when you think about it. But anyway, to stay on a more positive note, question from Asa again. Asa, I hope I pronounced it right. Valley, Valet from Swedish EPA. Can you estimate? Oh, this is a good one. They're all good questions, but this particular one, I think a lot of people are thinking as well.
Yeah.
Can you estimate how large a proportion of TFA is encountered originates in F gas as opposed to other sources like pharma, PFAS production, etc., pesticides, all that? What's the percentage? Is it the main source? Is it one of the main sources? Do we have an estimate?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's only one formal estimate I know, and that's by the German Environmental Agency. It was by the same, I think it was in the same study when I showed the
Yeah.
projected increases of the YF refrigerant. And that points to maybe, yeah, it's for F gases are the major contributor. And I think they were getting near 70% with 20 to 30% coming from pesticides mainly, and then pharmaceuticals in third place. But I'll just say that we do have to say that there are unknown, I think, sources out there that I'm getting that I think we have to look more into, because we don't really necessarily know the TFA emissions from, say, production of pesticides. We know maybe from what they put out there on the fields because they have to report that. But for instance, if they're producing their own TFA in their pesticide making process, that they don't have to report that because it's an intermediate. So if I was a betting man, I'd put my money on F gases, and there's definitely replacements for them. So this is like the first thing that we should get rid of. But I do think there's a lot of unknown sources. So I can't really say exactly how much the F gas is the number one source, but I would say it's at least 50%, probably more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then I'd like to follow up on that question. Would it be fair to say, because you talked about 100% of YF, 1234YF, this pure HFO, 100%, right? It's
Yeah.
100% TFA. That's pretty worrying when you compare it to 134A that's around about 20%.
Yeah.
So it's that in itself, when we've transitioned from 134A to 1235 in air conditioning in cars, that's a five-fold increase just from that change of refrigerant. Would it be fair to say that when you look at TFA from refrigerants, the biggest source would be from cars
Yeah. This
in
this
Europe?
this this is outside my expertise.
Okay. All right. Okay. Then okay. Well, we came up across some numbers, some projections of cars. There are estimates close to 100 million in Europe with YF. That's a lot of leaking cars. That's a lot of
Mhm.
YF leaking up into the atmosphere, even when they're parked.
Yeah.
So there is a concern there, we would argue. But all right. To stay focused on your presentation, I see another question, a comment maybe from Dorian Wolf. Yep. Estimates suggest F gases account for approximately 63% of all PFAS emissions. That's from ChemSec.
Mhm.
So similar to what you were saying, main source over 50%. Then a question from Hanan Barelli. Is there some scale of the HFO refrigerants to know which is the best and which is the worst? Uh,
Um, yeah, well, I mean, obviously, YF would be the worst in terms of TFA yields. I mean, they do have varying TFA yields amongst them.
yes. Yeah, and
Um,
there are different blends, right,
yeah,
using YF. And I know Professor Kaufelt in his previous webinar had a slide where he talked about different refrigerants and looked at the percentages of TFA from each of those refrigerants. So And then we'll make sure you get that presentation from Professor Calfelt. That I know he answered that question, unless Michael wants to add something now. But feel free if you're still online, Michael. Then another question: can we get the presentation? Yes, you will. You'll all get the presentation. Ah, there it is. So this, thank you, Michael. Magic. So there you have the list of different TFA formation potential. That's the second to last column per major refrigerants. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Michael. Then a question I have. So okay, so TFA is a PFAS, right? Um, and TFA is one of the hardest PFASs to get rid of, the most costly one. And even if we get rid of it in the water that we drink, it's going to be even more costly to get it from the orange juice, the beer, the wine, and everything else that we drink.
Yeah,
Am I
yeah,
summing
exactly.
up?
And there we can't do anything. I mean, you can't desalinate wine or juice like that. That's
Yeah.
you can't
So,
do that.
okay. And I mean, the cost to society is just, you can't count that number. It's just ridiculous. It's in the trillions, right?
Yeah, it
I
would
mean,
easily, yeah, it would be in the trillions. And even with PFAS, and I mean, when we look at the costs, it's not just the cost of remediation, it's the health costs, and we don't really know. But I mean, at least for the PFAS, there's if you don't do the cost, say, of remediating, which is expensive in the case of TFA, or the cost of transitioning your industry, whatever more the society would have to invest, then you're going to have to pay for it all in terms of health costs and environmental destruction costs. And the health costs, I mean, at least like for PFAS, like the known PFAS, that's, I mean, on a global scale, that's in the trillions, and on the continental scale, that's in the hundreds of billions. So I mean, if we don't do anything, then we'll be paying later more than what we've been the cheaper price of transitioning now. Yeah.
so I have a final question. Um, how long are we? How far are we? How many years are we from, in terms of research, from basically being able to say TFA that is accelerating cancers or certain cancers? Is that even possible to link the two? Is that something that we expect will come at one point when the more and more research focuses on that?
Yeah, that would be like it would need to be, you'd have to set up the epidemiological studies. And I mean, commenting on, like, for instance, on how quickly it takes them to do epidemiological studies for PFAS affected communities. I mean, once you even start the study, it takes some years to get some results, um, especially for cancer, because that's like a long-term exposure. And of course, TFA is also a long-term. It's like we're exposed to that our entire life. So it would be a long-term epidemiological study. And they haven't really started yet. So it might be really decades before we get solid data on that. But we can always look for early indications based on anecdotal data around people living near TFA hotspots. But as far as I know, there's nothing done in that epidemiological space yet.
Okay, so it's work in progress.
Yeah.
Um, uh, can we take a couple more minutes, or have you got to rush off? We've got
No,
more questions.
I can take a few more.
Your topic is popular, so let's give everyone the chance. So wait, which level of TFA in human body is ah what level are we talking about? What's the threshold when we can say above that threshold of TFA in your body, it's trouble? Where
Yeah,
are we? Where is what's it, when's the science going to be uh, fixed on that?
yeah, this is something I would want to defer to a toxicologist. I
Okay,
wouldn't want to be too quantitative on that. But I
okay,
mean, I think that's also important one to answer. But I can just say, at least from what we're exposed to now, we are reaching the minimum estimates of the harmful level. Like, just referring to the Dutch saying a level of 2.2 micrograms per liters, and that's based on what the human body burden will be from that drinking water, and just the drinking water. So I would say that taking the most conservative approach, we're already at that level where TFA might be harmful. And I would assume if I'm, and from a precautious point of view, I would say it's already happening to vulnerable populations now, because we have to remember that some subpopulations are more vulnerable than others. Obviously, embryos, obviously, babies, small children. So they might already be, some subpopulations might already be at a harmful level.
Yeah. Um, I missed a question from Henning. He asked how many TFA from rainwater concentration studies are running at the moment? Any upcoming publications in the near future that we can expect?
Um, I can I would just I can say that there's probably going to be a lot more, because now this is becoming
Topic,
an
right?
increasing topic, and the methods are now being spread rapidly. Like 5 years ago, there's only a few labs measuring TFA, but now it's a lot of research and regulatory pressure to get more data. So I assume we're going to see TFA, a lot more research coming on TFA in the years to come.
Yep. And TFA could that even replace the term PFAS as the kind of the baddie in this in people's minds? Is it that big a problem, TFA versus other PFASs?
Yeah, I think that I mean, it could be in certain areas, I think, where people know about PFAS. And I find it just interesting that it's really only the countries that have PFAS pollution in the media that really know about it, like Sweden
Mm.
or Belgium.
Denmark and
Like I live in Norway and I still have to tell people what PFAS are, but I have a feeling they understand the TFA thing better because they say it's in the
yeah.
rain, it's in your drinking water, and it's at high levels. And then so I think maybe in Norway they'll pick up on the general population will learn about TFA before PFAS, but in
Okay.
Sweden it's the other way around.
All right. Okay. I one last question, and that's it. And then in Europe, what is holding up further research in toxicity of TFA? And when will the ECHA, the chemicals agency in Helsinki, comment on the German repro toxicity link that they submitted, I think, last summer?
Mm-hmm.
When do we expect to hear about that? Do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, well, for the first part, yeah, I do hope there's more toxicity studies in Europe. Certainly, I mean, I think there was a lot done in the 1990s, and they kind of assumed that the risk was minimum, and that's what you find in the UNEP report. But I think now there's more recent data that for other systems that are showing that it can be toxic, and that is the general trend. Every PFAS that you can name, the safe threshold values have been decreasing over time as they look at more effects. Like, for instance, what's the immunotoxic effect of TFA? I don't think that's been researched. But now and that's what lowered the safe levels for other PFAS, the immunotoxicity. But when will the ECHA report be done?
Mm,
Coincidentally, I
yeah,
was at ECHA a few weeks ago and I asked them that,
you asked them the same question.
and they just said they're still doing some. There's still it's still in the technical, the going through the technical checks. So and it has to pass all the technical checks before they can look at the claims.
Okay.
So but as soon as the technical, and that has been going slower than they hoped, but as
Mm,
soon as the technical checks are resolved. So, but I do know it's a very, it's a dossier that they're reading very carefully. Yeah.
okay. All right. All right. So, no more questions. Do you, Hans-Peter, have any final comments?
No, no, I think I stated everything I can now, but yeah, but just feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. And
Yeah.
yeah, and just to your community, I would really pursue this idea of labeling like
Yep.
products, like somehow find that way of saying this is F-gas free. I think that would have a
Yeah.
good impact. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And we are working hard on that. All right. So, a round of applause, at least virtual round of applause. Thank you, Hans-Peter, for taking the time today to join us. And we will be sharing this video uh, presentation slide deck as well as an article our colleague Michael Gary will write up on this. So it will get spread very widely within the cooling and heating community worldwide. So hopefully that will then help disseminate your insights. So thank you again, and hope to see you again soon.
Okay.
Bye,
No,
everyone.
thank you very much. Bye bye, everyone.